Hello, my amazing children. This is Grandma Carla, and I am sorry that I cannot get this blue out of my glasses without taking off my glasses, and I can't read without my glasses, so it's just one of those irritations that you and I have to live with, and I'm sorry. But I am back with Chapter 6 of A Way Through the Sea by Robert Elmer, and this is Chapter 6, Tangled Up. With the fall came school, war or no war. For Peter, Elise, and Henrik, that meant there were only the weekends for biking and hiking around, taking the pigeons out for trips, being kids. And even though they had their ideas, they still hadn't figured out who the Swede in the woods was, exactly why Uncle Morton was meeting him there. At least, not for sure. Peter didn't think about that as he walked to the boathouse before school. It was his turn to feed the birds and check their water. Even though it was still only September, he could see his breath that morning, and he pretended that he was a steam train as he walked down to the waterfront. As usual, his grandfather was puttering around in the shed. "Morning, Grandpa," he called as he pushed open the door. Peter's grandfather looked up from his perch on a barrel. Like any good fisherman, even though he was mostly retired, he worked a lot on his nets and ropes, things like that. Peter measured out 5 handfuls of hard corn from the sack on a shelf, then checked the water bowl. Grandfather had built a cover for the bowl so the birds wouldn't mess it up or tip it over, and they could stick their little necks in to get a drink. Pigeons are one of the only birds that can drink out of their beaks like a straw, which Peter always thought was fun to watch. Most other birds have to get a mouthful and then tip it back to drink. The birds fluttered around Peter's feet as he tiptoed around the coop. He could see they were going to have to do some serious cleaning pretty soon. "Hey, Peter," said Grandfather as Peter finished his chore. "Your uncle needs a crewman or two to help him this weekend." He cleared his throat. "And I can't make it. Just a few hours tomorrow, Saturday. Short trip. You available?" Who was he kidding? Peter had wanted to go out with his uncle and his grandfather for as long as he could remember, but his parents had never let him yet, and he had really never been asked. "Sure, Grandpa," he replied, "but—" "I already talked to your father," he interrupted, "and we agreed you were old enough to go out this time. You won't be staying out overnight or anything. Your uncle leaves at 6:30. "Fantastic!" yelled Peter, closing the door to the coop. Then he stopped short. "But what about Elise and Henrik? You think his parents would let him come too?" "It's up to them. You can ask. Elise can come too if she wants. I'm just not sure if she does. Ask her at school today." Peter's grandfather smiled, then waved Peter out the door. "Out with you now, or you'll be late for school." School. Oh, yeah. Peter remembered that Henrik would be waiting for him at the big St. Mary's Church a couple of blocks from school. Now he would have to run to make it on time, as usual. "I'll be there first thing in the morning, 6 o'clock. "Don't be late," Grandfather called after him as Peter ran out the door. "Your uncle will be waiting for you." Peter hardly heard. "Wait until I tell Henrik and Elise." He met up with Henrik at church, where the other boy was waiting impatiently. "What took you so long?" asked Henrik, kicking a pebble down the street. "I had to talk to Grandfather about something," said Peter. "He asked if we wanted to go out on the boat Saturday." Henrik's eyes grew big. "No kidding? And it's okay with your folks?" "He said he already talked with them and everything, and if it's okay with your parents—" Henrik winced. "I don't know, Peter, but we can try. You know how my parents are. What about your sister?" "Did someone mention my name?" said Elise, who had just run up behind the boys on her way down the street. As usual, she had an armload of books, too many to keep in her red school backpack. She had Mrs. Becker, the other 5th grade teacher, in the classroom next to Henrik's and Peter's. Henrik wheeled around, surprised. Elise usually walked to school with her girlfriends. "Oh, it's you," he said. "Of course it's me," said Elise in a teasing manner. "So what did you mean, what about your sister?" Grandpa just asked me this morning when I was feeding the birds if we wanted to go out on their boat Saturday," said Peter, and he said Mom and Dad told him it was okay. "Great," she said, pulling at the strap of her backpack while she balanced her extra books in the other hand. "But do you think Henrik's parents will say yes?" She looked quickly over at Henrik, who was kicking the pebble again. "Maybe," said Peter, feeling hopeful. He was already thinking of all the foot-long herring his uncle and grandfather sometimes returned with. The little silvery fish were everybody's favorite, pickled and sliced on dark rye bread. It was something every Dane learned to eat almost before they could walk. "Yeah, maybe Mr. Jensen will cancel school today and give us a big party," said Henrik. He was smiling, but he and Peter both knew his chances were slim. Elise ran on ahead. Henrik and Peter made it to school, a large 3-story brick building on King Street. Just as the principal, Mr. Jensen, was closing the doors. "Just in time again, boys," he observed in his big bass drum voice. They made it to their classroom on the 2nd floor just as the bell rang. "No party," whispered Henrik as they slipped into their seats. No sooner had they sat down than Peter began daydreaming of going out on the boat the next day. He still couldn't believe it, not having to talk to his parents into anything. Incredible. The only bad part was not knowing if Henrik was going to be able to come. And what about Elise? Their teacher, Mr. Isaacson, began with math, but Peter was already far out to sea dreaming. "Maybe we'll bring back enough fish to give Mom some extra too. All the way out there on the water, feeling the waves. And if I can steer the boat?" When Peter looked up, everyone seemed to be staring at him. Even Henrik, sitting at the desk just across the aisle was giving him a strange look. "The answer, Peter?" Mr. Isaacson crossed his arms and looked straight at Peter. Behind him, Annalise Castrop giggled, and he could feel the back of his neck heating up, the way it always did when he was embarrassed himself. Desperately, he tried to focus back on the real world, tried hard to think of the teacher's question, but he was afraid to ask him to repeat it. "Something about fish? 100 herring?" Peter blurted out before he knew what was happening. Stupid. Why did he say that? Everybody broke out laughing, except Mr. Isaacson. It only made him look even more serious, more stern. "That's enough, class," said the teacher. He hardly moved his lips. They were so tightly compressed together, kind of like he was doing a talking puppet routine. His look seemed to drill a hole in Peter. "You may think that was a clever answer, Mr. Anderson, but we are talking about fractions today. You will stay after school this afternoon, please, to brush up on the subject, since you obviously need practice." "Yes, sir," said Peter, not looking up. Peter wanted to melt through the floor, and the back of his neck felt lobster red. Staying after school would only keep him from getting out to the boat and helping get it ready for the next day. He was in a daze all the rest of the morning until lunchtime, but luckily he wasn't called on again. "Where were you during math today?" Henrik asked when they were out eating their lunch in a small school auditorium. Elise usually ate with her friends, Tina or Susan. "You looked like you were in outer space or something when Mr. Isaacson asked you that question." Peter didn't know what to say, really. Besides, Kjeld Poulsen and Jesper Karl, the two people who gave him more pain than anyone else in the world, were sitting just down the bench from Peter and Henrik. Peter could tell as they scooted over close that they were coming in for a kill. "Hey, Anderson," snickered Kjeld, "where did you get that 100 herring from?" That was a bird-brained answer. He and his sidekick Jesper were real good at making people feel dumb, like now. Peter knew his face was probably going to get red all over again, and then Jesper would chime in for a second punch. Jesper was just as little and skinny as Kjeld was big and beefy, and he always copied everything Kjeld did. Quite a team, thought Peter. Obnoxious. Just then Peter was wishing he and Henrik had skipped lunch and headed straight for the yard by the side of the building. Not a bird-brained answer, Keld said, Jesper, sounding like the second half of a bad comedy team. A pigeon-brained answer. They were just warming up, daring Henrik and Peter to fight back. Hey, who asked you, Jesper? Surprised, Keld and Jesper whirled around on the bench to see who was challenging them. Peter knew the voice without looking up, but couldn't believe it. Elise. She had buzzed in at those two like a hornet, and when the stocky Keld stood up to face his attacker, they were practically nose to nose. But Elise wasn't going to let anyone get a word in edgewise. With her hands on her hips, she lit into him like a drill sergeant. You don't know the first thing about birds anyway, she said. By now, everyone on the side of the room was listening. Peter guessed Keld and Jesper were as surprised as anyone, including himself. And if you had any birds, they would probably fly away from you as fast. This war of words might have gotten serious if the school's air raid siren hadn't sounded just then, drowning out the rest of what Elise was saying. She looked around the room like the rest of the lunch crowd, as if expecting to see planes through the ceiling. In a moment, Mr. Isaacson took charge. Everyone down to the cellar, please, boomed the teacher when the siren dimmed for a moment. Line up at the door. Everyone picked up their lunches and started shuffling toward the door while the wail of the siren went on. They had done this before, but no matter how many times he heard it, the rising and the falling wail always gave Peter the shivers. All he wanted to do was plug his ears and be somewhere else. They would spend the next few minutes or maybe hours in the school cellar until the steady sound of the all-clear siren. Actually, it wasn't too bad because it gave them a chance to read or catch up on their homework. No one even cried anymore the way the younger kids had during the first 1 or 2 years of the war. They just lined up by the teacher with his hand in the air, chattering as if there were no British planes flying over their way to bomb Germany. Peter thought about it, though, and he didn't like the thought. Only once in a while did bombs fall on their own country in special German targets. Still, it made him nervous. One thing he was sure of, though. It got very stuffy in the cellar with all the kids down there. In all the excitement, Peter had almost forgotten about Keld. The boy was red, as if the steam was pouring out of his ears, but he didn't say a word until he brushed past Peter. When you're least expecting it, Anderson, he half shouted straight into Peter's ear. Even the constant sound of the siren didn't drown out his voice. When you don't have a girl to stick up for you, you'll wish you weren't alive. Peter pretended he didn't hear. But then, when he looked back to find Elise, she was gone. I'll thank her tonight when I get a chance. Actually, except for the fear that Keld would probably jump him in the alley someday and knock him silly, Peter didn't mind whoever wanted to stand up against Keld and Jesper. It was just surprised him that it was his own sister. Then Henrik brought him back to reality. Come on, Peter, he said, tugging at his friend's shirt. Are you going to stand there daydreaming all day? We have to get down to the air raid cellar. The cellar was just like any other classroom. Really, only there were no windows, and it was only big enough for the whole class, all 200 kids, to cram into. Peter and Henrik found seats with the rest of their class and took the reading books that were being passed around. It was a spooky feeling, being down in the cellar. The sound of the sirens somewhere above them made it worse. It was a short stay this time, though. They had hardly gotten their books open when the steady, all-clear siren sounded, and it was time to go back up to their normal classroom. That was quick, don't you think? Henrik poked Peter as they passed back their books. The Brits must have been just passing through again. Yeah, they must have, Peter replied, but his mind wasn't on air raids. The rest of the afternoon, Peter had to pinch himself a couple of times to keep with it, to not daydream about fishing boats or worry about being attacked by bullies. Only 2 more hours. He looked up at the clock in their classroom as Mr. Isaacson droned out about a spelling test. Make that 2.5 until school's out at 3:30. No more bird-brained answers, just stay with it. Henrik was waiting in the schoolyard when Peter finally came out that afternoon. Good old Henrik. He looked as if he was still excited about what had happened at lunch. Hey, that was some speech from your sister, wasn't it? Henrik asked as the two jogged along the street. Elise scared the socks off old Keld and Jesper. Uh-huh. Peter was thinking about old Keld and Jesper jumping out of the alley, so he kept an eye out as he slowed to a walk. I'm impressed, weren't you? Henrik went on. Did you see the way Keld just stood there and took it before the air raid? His ears turned beet red. I saw. Henrik obviously hadn't heard Keld's last message, but Peter wasn't going to say anything else. Maybe Keld will forget all about it, thought Peter, looking carefully around the corner, but maybe not. Anyway, if I'm going to live past today, I'd better keep an eye out. They continued on silently until they reached the door of Henrik's little apartment on Star Street, next door to the neighborhood pawn shop. Theirs looked so much like others in the city, a neatly painted narrow black door with numbers and a small brass plate. E. Melchior. Henrik took the stairs 3 at a time, with Peter right at his heels. In the tiny living room where Mrs. Melchior was folding laundry, Henry dumped his books on the couch. She looked a lot like her son, and her son like her, dark-haired, attractive, with sharp features. Hello, Mother. Guess what? Henrik asked in the same breath. Come in and don't leave your books on the couch, she answered. She smiled at Peter. Mother, Peter's dad said it's okay with them. Can I go too? If I knew what Mr. Anderson said okay about, I could answer you better, she said, looking up from a pair of socks she was folding. Oh, yeah, said Henrik. He was catching his breath. Fishing, going out on their boat, just for a day. We'll be back before dark. Peter's going. I'm not so sure, Henrik. He was catching his breath. Hold on. I'm not so sure, Henrik, said his mother. That's something we'll have to discuss with your father tonight when he gets home from work. Thanks, Mother. He'll say yes, won't he? Henrik was a pretty good salesman when he wanted to be. We'll have to see about that. That's about what Henrik and Peter had expected, and it was better than a flat-out no. There was no time to lose, though, so they ran on to Peter's apartment 3 blocks away, where Peter dumped his books. I'll be back for dinner, Mom, said Peter. Uncle Morton just needs a little help getting the boat ready so that we can leave first thing tomorrow morning. So bye. He finished his sentence as the door slammed behind them. He thought his mother said dinner 5:30, something like that, or was it 6? Down at the harbor, Uncle Morton had the floorboards of the fishing boat pulled up and stacked all over the wheelhouse, and the engine in the bottom of the small boat was in pieces. Grandfather was there, too, up to his waist in engine parts. He looked like one of those Greek mythology characters, half boat engine and on the bottom and half person on the top. His sleeves were rolled up, and his hands and his wrists were black with grease. Try it again, Morton, he said to his son. Peter's uncle was at the spoked wooden wheel, perched above the engine and balancing on a couple of beams where the floorboards used to be. He punched the big black starter button next to the wheel. Nothing happened. No click, no whir, no sound. Uncle Morton looked up long enough from what he was doing to flash a smile at Henrik and Peter as they climbed into the boat. Hey, boys, he said, you're just in time to help us get some things loaded while we fix the starter. He looked down at his father again. That is, if we can fix this starter. Think you can go back up to the shed and fetch those 3 piles of ropes by the workbench? There's a lot more. Sure, said Henrik. Peter climbed after him and back up the ramp that led down to the boat dock. Hey, these ropes are heavier than I thought, Peter grunted as they struggled with one pile. The ropes were hard to get a handle on. As his grandfather would say, it was like trying to put socks on an octopus. Trip after trip, the boys struggled with those piles of rope, and then fishing floats, tools, and extra parts Uncle Morton directed them to bring down to the boat. Elise arrived a few minutes later and helped with a few loads as well. The 3 of them were picking up the last load in the boathouse when they heard the roar of the boat engine down on the dock. They looked at one another and cheered, then piled everything that was left into their arms. Peter could hardly see over the top of his armload, and by the time they were halfway down the ramp, he heard the engine shut down again. He looked over his load to see a man in a gray uniform standing by the boat. It was not a Danish policeman. Without thinking, he froze in fright, and Henrik, with the same kind of load in his arms, bumped hard into him from the rear. In one scary moment, Peter felt himself tumbling down the ramp head first. They turned into a tangle of arms, legs, a mop, buckets, a piece of rope, and a spare part for the engine, and they couldn't stop until they were lying in a heap at the German soldier's mirror shiny high boots. He didn't move an inch, as if he were daring the boys to crash into him. Elise stood helplessly at the top of the ramp, her eyes wide with horror. At the bottom of the heap, Henrik let out a shriek of pain, but stopped abruptly when he saw the German. It sounded as if a big hand had clamped hard over his mouth. Peter didn't want to look up, but he had to, and he saw a frowning German officer looking down his nose at a tangle of boys and boat stuff. "Who are these two?" the officer demanded. His Danish sounded mainly like German, but Peter could tell he wasn't fooling around. "Just my grandson and his friend," Grandfather explained. "They're helping me get the boat ready, putting in some supplies. Are you all right, boys?" The officer didn't wait for Peter or Henrik to answer. "I see that," he snipped. He was probably Uncle Morton's age, tall, straight, and dark-haired. He was standing as if he wore a board under the back of his gray wool uniform, 100% serious. The only thing that looked out of place was his crooked nose, which had obviously been broken somewhere along the line. "Are these regular crew members?" "No," replied Grandfather. "They're just kids." The two untangled themselves and tried to pick up some of the mess, the stuff that was scattered all over the dock. Elise tiptoed quietly down the ramp to help. A mop was floating in the water next to the dock, and she fished it up. Henrik had a strange expression on his ash-colored face, and he was sweating like crazy. Peter was pretty nervous, too, even more nervous than the time they had let the pigeons go at the Marienlust Hotel. He was thinking about Henrik, the Jew, again. Then Peter looked back up at his grandfather, searching for some kind of encouragement. Uncle Morton was behind him, wiping his hands on a rag. He winked at his nephew. "So you will report anything you see," said the officer to the men, still standing in the same spot. "Immediately." It was not a question. "We'll keep our eyes open. You'll be the first to hear," said Uncle Morton. He didn't sound too convincing. "If criminals are sneaking around, as you say, we have no need for them." Peter couldn't believe his ears, but he didn't say anything. In a moment, the German swiveled on his toe and walked quickly up the ramp. "He's gone," said Uncle Morton, after they had all watched the gray uniform disappear. That's when Peter and Elise looked over at Henrik, who was making a funny little whimper. His knees folded under him, and he fainted quietly onto the dock. Uncle Morton vaulted out of the boat past Grandfather. Everyone crowded around Henrik and tried to lay him on his back. "Henrik!" yelled Peter. "What's going on?" "Don't yell at him," snapped Elise. "He fainted and he can't hear you anyway." Henrik wasn't answering right away, but it was only a few moments before his eyes fluttered open again. Uncle Morton wadded a jacket and placed it under his head, and Grandfather covered him with another coat he had found in the boat. "My arm! My arm! My arm!" Tears were streaming down his face. Uncle Morton touched Henrik's arm where there was a lump, and the boy yelled. Uncle Morton looked up. "It's probably broken," he said, "but I can't believe you didn't say anything until now. Why not?" Henrik tried to catch his breath. "I couldn't say anything while he was here," he choked. "I just couldn't." "Well, let's get you to a doctor," said Grandfather. "This is going to take some looking after. Can you walk?" He could, barely, and Uncle Morton put his arm around the boy's waist as he guided him down the street to the neighborhood clinic on Star Street. But the arm, Henrik's left arm, did turn out to be broken. It's not so bad that it won't heal just fine, said Dr. Rasmussen, closing up his bag. He had just finished putting a small cast on Henrik's forearm. Henrik said the pain was still terrible, but with his parents around, he was grinning away from where he sat on the clean hospital bed. He smiled at the doctor, Uncle Morton, Grandfather, Elise, and Peter. He had a small audience in the clinic room, and Henrik was performing. So, doctor, will I be able to play the piano after my arm heals? Henrik asked. No, Mr. Melchior, replied the doctor straight-faced. Not unless you start taking lessons. Ah, you didn't fall for it, said Henrik. I've heard that one before, the doctor replied, looking down at his clipboard. He was smiling, though. Take very good care of this arm for a month or so. No tumbling or arm wrestling. Keep the activity down and come back in 6 weeks. Thanks so much, doctor, said Mrs. Melchior. When Henrik suddenly frowned, this means I won't be able to go out with Peter and his uncle tomorrow on the boat, right? Henrik's dad had already heard about the trip. Now he looked even more serious than he usually did, and his black, bushy eyebrows were bunched close down over his eyes. He was rather short and stubby-looking, not at all athletic like his son, and the decision about the fishing trip was already made for him now. I think you know the answer to that, son, he said. I'm sorry. You heard the doctor. Henrik groaned. Then he looked at his friends. But you'll go anyway, right? Peter? Elise? Peter wasn't so sure. Since the tumble on the dock, he felt all jumbled inside. He felt terrible that Henrik getting hurt and how he made him fall even though it was an accident. But Henrik hadn't even let anyone apologize. At least he isn't mad at me, thought Peter. He remembered that his uncle had said to the German officer, and that was bothering him too. None of it fit. None of it seemed right. And he had a giant headache. Right, Peter? Henrik asked. Well, I guess so, replied Peter, not really knowing what he was saying. If Uncle Morton is still going out, it wouldn't be quite as fun, Henrik at home with a broken arm. But yes, he still did want to go out. I'm planning on it, Peter, said Uncle Morton. We still have to go out and make a living, even though I'm not planning a long day tomorrow. The fish are waiting. Then he turned to Elise. And what about you, young lady? You're coming too? Elise looked down, then over at her uncle. I can't, she said hesitantly. You and Peter will have fun. Maybe I can go out next time. Obviously embarrassed, she turned and ran outside. Uncle Morton looked puzzled, but just shrugged and turned to Henrik's father. I'm very sorry it happened this way, said Morton. Your son was helping us, but it was an accident. The boys weren't horsing around or anything. Oh, I fully realize, said Mr. Melchior, waved his hand, dismissing the situation. And no one is blaming you. These things happen sometimes. He sounded polite and calm, but at the same time he pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the sweat off his forehead. Peter wasn't sure whether he was upset about Henrik getting hurt or about the German down on the dock. The officer had been looking for something or someone. Before Peter left for home, he saw Mr. Melchior and Uncle Morton move back to the corner of the clinic, behind a cabinet full of bandages and supplies. Mr. Melchior was gesturing, not mad, but making a point. Peter's uncle put his hand on the other man's shoulder and said something else to him. Peter didn't want to seem too nosy, so he didn't stare. But as everyone left, the two men were still in the corner, whispering. Uncle Morton looked up and waved to Peter. Tomorrow, early, right? He said. 6 o'clock, Peter called back as he headed out, looking for Elise. Wait a minute, said Henrik, as Peter was just about to close the door. I have an idea. Why don't you send a message back with number 2? Peter thought for a second, then brightened a bit. Sounds great. Check the boathouse with Elise at 3 or 4 o'clock to see if the birds made it back. I'll make it out of the sick bed for that, at least, Henrik laughed as Peter left. Peter found Elise outside the clinic, and they walked home together, neither of them saying a word. He wanted to say something that might make her feel better, but he couldn't. So there's a mystery here. And next time we'll read Chapter 7 on the sound. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.